Hi there, this is week 3. This is video 7. So in video 7 we're talking about supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. Those 4 muscles make up the rotator cuff group. And then we're also talking about rhomboids, levator, scapula, and serratus anterior. So let's go ahead and start out in the app and we'll get a good visual of these muscles, and then we'll come back out and take a look at actions. Okay, so let's go to the app. Okay, let's take a look at our muscles. So let's add on. First, we'll look at the rotator cuff group. So here's the rotator cuff group. In fact, first, before we even look at that, let's put on everybody. So we've looked at trapezius. We've looked at deltoid. Okay, so we're going to remove that superficial layer, and now we're looking deep to those, and we've also looked at latissimus dorsi, right? Okay, so let's get rid of those guys. Now we're going to look at the rotator cuff group to start out with. So that's these muscles that attach to the scapula. So we have this guy, supraspinatus. Supraspinatus is named for its location, which is above the spine of the scapula. So supra, above. Spinatus refers to the spine of the scapula, supraspinatus. So it attaches there in the supraspinous fossa, and that's its origin. Its insertion, or its distal attachment, is the superior portion, or the superior facet, on the greater tubercle of the humerus. So remember, the greater tubercle has 3 facets, and we're going to see those 3 muscles that attach to each of those 3 facets here in just a moment. So here was our first one, supraspinatus. Next rotator cuff muscle is infraspinatus. That's right here. Infraspinatus is named again for the infraspinous fossa, which is the space that it fills in on the scapula. It goes from the infraspinous fossa, and remember that means below the spine of the scapula. It goes from the infraspinous fossa to the greater tubercle, again, of the humerus, and this time it's just a notch below where supraspinatus attached. So if we imagine a letter S on the, let's do the pen. Here we go. Okay, if we imagine a letter S here, where supraspinatus attaches at the superior facet, and then an I, where infraspinatus attaches, that'd be on the middle facet, and then our next muscle down is teres minor, which attaches right here, so we'll put a T. That's supposed to be a T right there. So now we have the word sit running down the greater tubercle of the humerus. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and then our third one here, teres minor. So let's do this. There's, oops. Okay. Pen is gone. Infraspinatus. Now we're looking at teres minor. Teres minor, the third of our rotator cuff muscles, is here. So teres minor attaches to the upper half. Let's fade some other muscles so we can kind of see this a little better. The upper half of the lateral border of the scapula, and then it goes straight across the back of the glenohumeral joint and attaches at that the lower facet, the inferior facet on the greater tubercle. So this is teres minor. So remember that we've already learned its buddy teres major, which is this guy here. Teres major also attaches to the proximal humerus, but it attaches to the anterior aspect of the proximal humerus, remember? So if we're looking at teres major, we'll see its attachment here at the lateral lip of the bicipital groove. So it attaches to the anterior humerus. Teres minor attaches to the posterior humerus. So one goes one direction, one goes the other direction. Teres major, therefore, this one, teres major, can medially rotate the humerus, and teres minor, this one here, can laterally rotate the humerus. Okay, so see how they go in different directions around to get to their attachment on the humerus there. This is our first major and minor pair. So basically, a major and minor pair means that one muscle is bigger and the other muscle is smaller. We're going to see pectoralis major and pectoralis minor in the next video. But this is teres major and teres minor. So this is teres major, larger than, but in a very similar location to teres minor, which is the smaller of the two in the pair. Okay, let's look at our fourth rotator cuff muscle. That's this one here, subscapularis. So subscapularis is the only one on the anterior aspect of the scapula. Let's fade this stuff, and there we can see a nice image of subscapularis. So it fills in that subscapular fossa on the anterior aspect of the scapula, and then crosses the glenohumeral joint anteriorly. So it can medially rotate the humerus, and it's the only of the rotator cuff muscles that can do that. The other rotator cuff muscles cross back here, and as far as infraspinatus goes and teres minor goes, they can laterally rotate the humerus. Okay, so just a couple of things about the rotator cuff muscles as a group. So here they all are again: supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis, which we can only see there. We can see subscapularis. So what do these guys do as a group? When we do the action section in this video, we'll look at specifically the action of each of the muscles. But as a group, these muscles have a couple of specific functions. One is to help to keep the head of the humerus oriented in the glenoid fossa of the scapula. So it helps to keep the shoulder together and keep the head of the humerus in place. That's one important function of the rotator cuff group. Another important function of the rotator cuff group is that they act as a brake. So these muscles are the muscles that, like I said, they keep the head of the humerus in place, and they do that even when the humerus is moving, and especially when the humerus is moving at high speed. So imagine throwing a ball really hard and fast, using big muscles to do that, so generating a lot of speed, and we have all that speed generated. We don't want the humerus to go chasing after the ball that we just threw, right? We want it to stay in the shoulder, and that's what these muscles do. They hold on to that head of not exactly the head, but that proximal end of the humerus, and keep it oriented correctly with the glenohumeral, or with the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Okay, so that's the rotator cuff group: supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. Let's move on and take a look at our other muscles in this video. Let's see here. All right, here we have the rhomboids. So the rhomboids on this app don't super duper look like a rhomboid shape, but let's pretend they do. Okay, here they are. Let me just sort of outline them and kind of pretend we can see a rhomboid shape here. If I exaggerate it a little, it looks kind of like a rhomboid, right? So the rhomboids, we have rhomboid major and rhomboid minor, but we're going to look at them as a group, just as the rhomboids, not separately. But we can see them attaching to spinous processes along midline. And, so that's their medial attachment is to the spinous processes, and then their lateral attachment is to the medial border of the scapula. Okay, so I can only indicate either the majors or the minors on here, not the whole group together, but this is rhomboid major. But you can see that they attach here along the medial border of the scapula. All right. And then we'll take a look at actions in a minute for this group. So these are the rhomboids. Next muscles we want to look at, and let me just say this, we can guess the actions, right? We can see the fiber direction across like this and like that. We can see the fiber direction, we can see the attachments, and so from that, I know we can figure out the actions. All right, let's just get a quick visual on the rest of our muscles, and then we'll take a look at actions. So our next muscle here is levator scapula. Now levator scapula is an interesting looking muscle. If we look at it from here, it just looks like, oh yay, there's that muscle, kind of the posterior lateral neck. That's true. And we can see its attachment at the scapula right through here. So it's along the medial border from the superior angle to the root of the spine. So if we combine, combine levator, scapula, and the rhomboids, we cover the entire medial border of the scapula as far as attachments there. Okay, but the interesting look of levator comes not from this view, but from this view. So let's take a look at this guy. So see how it attaches here. Where it's attaching there is the transverse processes of the cervical vertebra. So if we can zoom in maybe on a cervical vertebra and oops, let's get rid of muscles here so we can see the cervical vertebra. All right. So if we zoom in on one of these guys, there's a transverse process here. The transverse process, let's get a good view, is right there. Oh, that's supposed to be an arrow. That's the transverse process. See how that kind of sticks off there to the side? So those transverse processes are the attachment sites for levator scapula. So let's put muscles back and take a look at levator. Oops, I went too far. Okay, here's levator. All right, so see that? See how levator scapula attaches to the transverse processes of the cervical vertebra 1 through 4, and each vertebra, each transverse process of each vertebra has a distinct set of fibers of levator scapula attaching to it. So see how it sort of splays and splits there. So what we're going to see with levator is we're going to see it being able to move the scapula. We're also going to see it being able to move the neck. Okay, so that's levator scapula. And our last one that we're looking at here today is down here. This is serratus anterior. So serratus anterior gets its name from its shape. The term serratus refers to it having this serrated look, you know, like a serrated knife. And anterior means it's anteriorly oriented. Although, okay, let's be real, it's kind of on the back and around the side of the body. So why do we call it serratus anterior? Well, it's because there are other serrated muscles, or muscles with that name, serratus. And so we have to distinguish it from those. And those are these back here. We have serratus posterior superior, so you can still see that serrated look, and serratus posterior inferior. Again, that serrated look down there. So oftentimes muscles that attach to ribs like these do have sort of a serrated look along the edge of it, because part of it goes to one rib, then part of it goes to the next rib. Anyway, so these are serratus posterior muscles, and so serratus anterior, the one we're looking at today, is called serratus anterior because it's more anterior than these two serratus muscles in the back. All right, let's look at serratus anterior. Oh my gosh, he's going everywhere. Okay. Serratus anterior is a pretty deep muscle, and let's put some skin on our person here, because we're going to watch this muscle disappear once we have skin on. So with skin, what can we see of serratus anterior? We can see a little bit like right through here, right? And that's about all you can see of serratus anterior once the rest of the muscles are in place. Let's get rid of skin, and there's serratus anterior. And so where does it go? It attaches to the medial border of the scapula back here. Doesn't look like it, right? Didn't we just talk about rhomboids and levator scapula attaching? Let me put rhomboids back so we're not confused about that. There they are. We talked about rhomboids and levator scapula attaching to the medial border of the scapula. Well, that's true, but serratus anterior also attaches there. But how does it get there? Let's fade everybody else and see it goes underneath the scapula, and you can kind of see that attachment there. All along the medial border, but on the anterior side of the scapula, okay? Hopefully that you can see that. So on the anterior side of the medial border of the scapula, that's where we find serratus anterior. So it attaches there on the scapula, and then it attaches on ribs 1 through 9. So look at the attachments on ribs 1, 2, and 3. It's like kind of splayed all over the place, getting up there to rib 1 and rib 2. And then by the time it gets down to rib 3, it's kind of falling in line there, and we have more regular sections of the muscle. But it goes all the way down to rib 9. So what we have is some fibers going from the scapula and then attaching up above the scapula, and some fibers going from the scapula and attaching down below the scapula, and a lot of the fibers going from the scapula and just sort of wrapping around and attaching to the ribs, sort of, anterior to the scapula. So what are we going to see with actions with serratus anterior? We're going to see stabilization actions, and we're going to see opposing actions. So serratus anterior can be its own antagonist in some actions, which we can see because we have fibers that are going up and fibers that are going down from the scapula. Okay, so those are our muscles on this video today. Let's take a look at the movements of each of those muscles. All right, let's take a look at actions of these muscles. So we're starting with, back to the rotator cuff group, starting with supraspinatus. So if you have your book in front of you, you can see what supraspinatus looks like, and remember how the whole rotator cuff group kind of, gathers around the head of the humerus. So supraspinatus is on top here, so its attachments, excuse me, I have an itchy nose. Its attachments, again, are the supraspinous fossa. Pardon all the dogs barking. I hope you can hear me okay. The supraspinous fossa of the scapula is one attachment. Its other attachment is the greater tubercle of the humerus. So its main action is abduction of the arm at the shoulder, or abduction at the glenohumeral joint. So remember what muscle we've talked about already that does abduction of the arm at the shoulder, or abduction at the glenohumeral joint? That is deltoid. So deltoid is a big, strong muscle that does this abduction action. And so why do we need supraspinatus if we already have deltoid to do that action? Well, the answer is supraspinatus initiates that movement. And so supraspinatus begins the movement and takes it through the first few, say like 15 degrees or so of the movement, and then from there deltoid is in a better position to pick up the movement and take the arm higher. So it initiates the movement, but also supraspinatus is in a good position. So if you look at in the book at the actions for supraspinatus, you'll see abduction and you'll see flexion of the arm at the shoulder. And so really what supraspinatus does is a movement that's kind of halfway in between abduction and flexion, which is like, again, that's real life. When in real life are we just doing flexion or just doing abduction? Far more often we're doing something in between those, and we don't really have a specific name for that movement in that oblique plane, but that's what supraspinatus does. So it's kind of a combination of flexion and abduction. So that's supraspinatus. Now infraspinatus, one more thing about supraspinatus. So it crosses the joint superiorly. So that is what exactly puts it in a good position to do abduction. It crosses superiorly and slightly anteriorly, so it can do a little flexion as well. So if we keep thinking about where each of these muscles crosses the joint, we're going to be able to figure out the actions that they do. So let's drop down now. The next muscle down is infraspinatus. So infraspinatus crosses the joint more posteriorly. So it goes, more or less across the back of the shoulder. So its fibers are in a good position to laterally rotate the shoulder or laterally rotate the arm or the humerus in the glenohumeral joint, and also horizontal abduction is which your book calls horizontal extension, is another action of infraspinatus. So, but if you can see the muscle, see the fiber direction, see the attachments. So again, the attachments are the infraglenoid fossa of the scapula and the glenoid, and the greater tubercle of the humerus. Okay, so it does this, kind of more in this plane, this lateral abduction or extension and lateral rotation. Next muscle down, teres minor, crosses the joint similarly. Teres minor. So teres minor is a little bit below infraspinatus, and so it crosses the shoulder joint posteriorly, but in a horizontal way, but it's also being below infraspinatus. It kind of crosses underneath the shoulder joint also. So actions for teres minor, it laterally rotates the arm, or laterally rotates the humerus, or laterally rotates the shoulder or the arm in the or at the glenohumeral joint. Many ways to say the same thing. And it adducts the arm at the shoulder. So adduction of the arm at the shoulder is bringing the arm down, which that tells us that this muscle needs to cross, low enough down that it can pull down on the arm and adduct it. And then it also horizontally abducts the arm. That is teres minor. So teres minor, very similar to teres major in location and similar in some ways in actions, but there's a significant difference between actions and a slight difference in location. So if we remember teres major, it attaches to the lateral border of the scapula, the lower half of the lateral border of the scapula, and then it comes through the armpit around to the front and attaches to the medial lip of the bicipital groove. And so teres major is in good position to do medial rotation of the shoulder, or of the arm at the shoulder, whereas teres minor attaches a little higher up on the lateral border of the scapula, so it's like the upper half of the lateral border of the scapula, and it goes straight across the back of the humerus, or of the shoulder joint. So it doesn't come through the joint or through the armpit region the way teres major does. So teres major comes through and does medial rotation. Teres minor goes straight across the back, and so it does lateral rotation. And so major and minor do opposite actions there because they kind of wrap around the humerus in opposite directions. So teres major does medial rotation, teres minor does lateral rotation. And then our fourth muscle of the rotator cuff group is subscapularis. So subscapularis is the one that's on the anterior side of the scapula. It crosses again, the fibers go this direction across the shoulder, but it is the only one of the four that crosses anteriorly, and so it is in a good position to medially rotate the humerus. So subscapularis, that's the action for subscapularis, is medial rotation of the arm at the shoulder. Okay, so those are the four rotator cuff muscles and their actions. But remember, rotator cuff muscles, a lot of what they're doing is stopping fast forward momentum of the humerus. When like in a throwing action, they're going to keep that humerus from following the ball that it just threw, and it's going to keep it with the glenohumeral joint, or with the glenoid fossa. And they also just when the arm is just at rest, they're helping to keep the head of the humerus in the glenoid fossa. So as a group, that's what the rotator cuff muscles are doing. Let's see, let's look at what next. Rhomboids. Rhomboids on page 100. So the rhomboids, so their name is based on their shape. They're a rhomboid shape, so they kind of make a shape like this in the back. So the spine is here between the right and left rhomboid, and then the medial border of the scapula are on either side. So specifically, the attachments for the rhomboids are the spinous processes of C7 to T5. So on these, you need to know the rhomboids as a whole group. You don't have to know specifically where rhomboid major and rhomboid minor attach. So just as a group, they attach to the spinous processes of C7 to T5, and then the medial border of the scapula from the root of the spine to the inferior angle. So the whole lower portion of the medial border of the scapula. So the fibers of rhomboid go like this, and so what action are the rhomboids going to do? They're going to pull the scapula toward each other and toward the spine. So what do we call that action? We call it adduction of the scapula, or retraction is the other name for it. What do they call it in the book? Let's look. Retraction. They call it retraction of the spine, or of the scapula. So the rhomboids do retraction. They also do elevation because their fibers are like this. Their fibers aren't straight across like this, which is kind of more how the medial fibers of or the middle fibers of trapezius are. Rhomboid is more tipped like this, so they don't just pull straight across, they also pull up. So they kind of pull up and back. So they also elevate the scapula. So they retract the scapula, they do elevation of the scapula, and they downwardly rotate the scapula. So remember what that is. So we'd have to upwardly rotate the scapula first in order for downward rotation to happen. But if you can imagine, so here my hand is pretending to be that scapula in the back. I've done upward rotation here. Now remember, these fibers are like this on rhomboids, so they're going to pull that inferior angle back into position to do downward rotation of the scapula, okay? So those are our actions of rhomboids. What were they? They were retraction of the scapula, elevation of the scapula, and downward rotation of the scapula. Now, very similar actions we're going to see with levator scapula. So levator scapula, remember that's the one that has these 4 attachments on the transverse processes of vertebra, cervical vertebra 1 through 4, and then it goes to the medial border of the scapula from the superior angle to the root of the spine. So together, levator scapula and rhomboids fill in that entire medial border of the scapula from the superior angle all the way down to the inferior angle. Levator scapula, its name, levator, sounds like what? Like an elevator or something like that, right? It means it lifts. And scapula refers to, what does that refer to? Oh, I know, the scapula. So levator scapula means it lifts the scapula. So its name tells you what it does, and which also has to tell you something about where it attaches, because if it's going to elevate the scapula, it's got to be attached to the scapula, and it's in order to move it, but also it has to be attached above the scapula if it's going to elevate the scapula. So, so levator scapula actions, its main action, guess what? Elevation of the scapula, okay? You could have guessed that, and I know that you did already. So elevation of the scapula, it also retracts the scapula. The only action that you really need to know as far as movement on the scapula for levator is elevation of the scapula. But its other actions that I'm not asking you to memorize are the same actions as rhomboids, which is retraction of the scapula and downward rotation of the scapula. But the actions I want you to know are elevation of the scapula, and then I also want you to know the movements where levator scapula is moving at the cervical spine, because those are important movements of that muscle. So it extends the neck at the cervical joint. So remember what that looks like. This is flexion, and this is extension, and we could even call this extension. Okay, so levator is going to bring those transverse processes back into anatomical position. If we've done flexion, there's going to bring it back into extension. So extension of the neck at the spinal joints, and that we would call a bilateral action, right? Because both the right and left sides would be working together to do extension of the neck. What about a unilateral action? Unilaterally, it flexes the spine it laterally flexes the spine. So if one side of levator scapula is working on its own, it can pull down on those transverse processes, bring the transverse processes closer to the scapula, and do that lateral flexion. That'd be a unilateral action. So lateral flexion of the neck at the spinal joints. And the third is an ipsilateral rotation. So remember when we learned a contralateral rotation that trapezius did? Trapezius, the upper fibers of trapezius, did a contralateral rotation, meaning that when the fibers on the right pulled at the occiput and the scapula was fixed, it turned the head to the left. That is a contralateral rotation. Levator scapula does an ipsilateral rotation. So what that means is, think about these transverse processes. They're more anteriorly oriented on the cervical spine than the spinous processes. And so when levator scapula pulls, it's going to pull those transverse processes back toward the scapula, and so when the right side works, we're going to get an action where the head turns to face the right. That's an ipsilateral rotation. Ipsi meaning same side, ipsilateral meaning same side. So the right side works, it makes the head turn to the right. That's an ipsilateral rotation. Okay. one more muscle is serratus anterior. Okay, serratus anterior. So remember that big muscle that sort of like disappears under the rest of the muscles once we put the rest of the body together? That's serratus anterior. So attachments for serratus anterior, it attaches to ribs 1 through 9, which we saw on the app. So all the way up here at ribs 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So ribs 1 through 9 it attaches to, and it goes underneath the scapula, all the way underneath to attach along the medial border of the scapula on the anterior aspect of it. So this muscle, so we see, we can see fibers of this muscle going, in various directions. So we have fibers, heading upward toward ribs 1, 2, and 3. Fibers heading downward to ribs 7, 8, and 9, and fibers kind of, wrapping around a little more in the front, sort of in the middle. So because of fibers going in different directions, we're going to see actions going in different directions, right? Just as we would expect. So primary action of serratus anterior is protraction of the scapula. So protraction of the scapula, what does that look like? It looks like this. It's that rounding forward, or like to do it with one arm if my arm is already in flexion. It's this. It's moving the scapula forward. And so if you think about athletes that you see well-defined serratus anteriors on, those would be athletes that do that kind of, that action a lot. And so one group that comes to mind for me are boxers or MMA fighters, where there's punching involved. So when this, so there's this, kind of forward movement of a punch, but then when the scapula goes forward too, then that's serratus anterior, moving the scapula anteriorly, doing that protraction action. And imagine on a push-up, that you can do a push-up and just, stay in that push-up position, but then you can also push the push the scapula forward and bring the torso up a bit more. That's another example of that protraction of the scapula, but in that situation, the trunk is moving and the scapula is fixed. So anyway, protraction of the scapula. So in fact, serratus anterior is prime mover in protraction of the scapula, meaning that it is the strongest muscle that does that action. It also does upward rotation of the scapula. So remember, upward rotation is this action, upward rotation of the scapula, and elevation of the scapula. But guess what? It also depresses the scapula, and it downwardly rotates. Oh, sorry. Does it downwardly rotate the scapula? No, it downwardly. It only upwardly rotates. Sorry. Okay. So protraction of the scapula and upward rotation of the scapula, but it elevates and depresses the scapula. Okay, because fibers are going in opposite directions, in various directions. So there are fibers that go, up above the scapula that do elevation. There are fibers that go down below the scapula that do depression. A lot of the fibers come forward from the scapula to do that protraction, and then it also does the upward rotation, which looks like this, which is it rotating the scapula. So serratus anterior really is in a great position to move the scapula, but also, since it can move the scapula in so many directions, what does that mean? It means it's also very good at stabilizing the scapula. So this is a muscle that when the scapula needs to be stable so that we can make some movement of the arm with the scapula staying put, serratus anterior is a muscle that's working hard to do that. Okay, so that's it for this video. Those are our muscles. So we had the rotator cuff group, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. And then we had rhomboids, we had levator scapula, and we had serratus anterior. So those are muscles, all muscles that attach to the scapula. And so we've looked at a lot of muscles at this point that attach to the scapula. Let's do a brief look at homework for this video. So you can either complete coloring book pages 302 through 305, or you can draw the muscles on a friend and have them move through the actions and send me a brief video of that. So palpating these muscles and seeing them three-dimensionally, finding those landmarks and getting that seeing that movement of you know, one landmark or one attachment site moving closer to the other attachment site is a great way to wrap your head around the movement of these muscles. Okay, so let's see, our word for this video is rotator cuff. Okay, that's 2 words, but we'll be okay with that. Rotator cuff for video 7, and we'll be back then next with video 8, in which we will talk about muscles of the chest. Super quick, easy video, right? We're just talking about like 3 muscles. Groovy. Okay, see you in video 8.